So yes, I was very much looking forward to meeting you, to seeing you, and to co-creating with you.
I was too, and I have to say, when I read the emails, I was like, there is just such a different feeling to your emails,
Mhm.
and I was like, this is this idea of co-creation people talk about, but yeah, it was really clear you meant it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like it was felt rather than just cognitively a word being used. Uh,
Yes.
so yeah, I think that that's really cool.
I love it. Yes, because at the end, it's what I see for the future, and everything we do is co-creation. Future, not. It's what I see today, so
Mm,
that we have a beautiful future.
mm,
And it's really to sit. And when you are in relationship with someone, like I'm here with you,
mm,
I'm in my heart, I'm present and in the now. I don't worry about what I have to say, or I don't have a script to follow because I am being me.
mm,
So you are being you. And that's what, at the end, I think is what nurtures me and nurtures you
mm,
and nurtures whoever else is listening, no?
mm,
But, and it's a respect towards me and towards you.
mm. And yeah, because very often we have to be places we don't want to be present to. Like we're in a meeting we don't want to be in, or things happen and but then I think we can also get used to not being present even in the places that we want to be present,
Yeah.
you know. And there is something about, we tend to remember when people showed up more so than what they said. And like, I know there's loads of quotes about it, but I've attended many talks or listened to many podcasts, and the person wasn't present. They were doing something, but they were more present to whatever they were doing than to actually what
Mm-hmm.
was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think it can be felt even if we don't always log it even cognitively. I think we feel it. At least I know I feel it. I get a strong sense. I'm like, oh, they're saying the right things, but something feels off
Oh,
about it. Hmm.
yes, yes. And it's also, yes, because you see many times, yeah, you're in a meeting or so, or you're having a conversation and people are taking notes and they are in the note taking,
Mm,
or they're looking into their notes, what's missing. So really, that's the head, the one that it's looking in there and saying, okay, but it's not present.
mm, mm,
And so I wanted you to understand why we are co-creating, what it really means. And so I wanted it for you to know upfront, because also many times people are not used to that, and they
mm,
are scared to be themselves, and not be interviewed, but
mm,
and not to think that the other person is not going to ask them questions, so they wouldn't know what to say.
mm. Yeah, it's funny because I find sometimes having the questions in advance more nerve-wracking than just being in conversation. Because in conversation I can say the thing, but when sometimes for me when I have too much prep, actually, I can overthink it, or I can, I'm preparing something for a presentation tomorrow and it's on an academic, quite a like boring research, like really interesting topic, but and I'm like, you know, how do I make sure I share it from how I feel about it instead of like proving that I did the academic rigor? Because it's not really about
Mm-hmm.
that. But it's really interesting because I'm also acknowledging that there's an expectation of something. And
Mm-hmm.
that expectation then changes how I feel about what I'm going to do. So um yeah, I do find I prefer off the cuff, but also that's an Irish thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
generally, I don't want to say like everyone, but Irish people do like the side conversation, the informality,
Mm-hmm.
obviously not everyone, but quite often you get a lot of richness in the informality rather than in the formality of things.
Yes.
And I kind of like that. I
Yeah.
always joke I'll never be the like we kind of have, and this might not be accurate now, but we have a thing that like Americans are very happy
Mm-hmm.
and they're very salesy, like everything is
Mm-hmm.
fabulous. And in Ireland, we're like, if you say it's fabulous, it better like knock our socks off. We're okay with like it's good. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you know, um, but I would never be that polished piece because actually it makes me more nervous to try to be polished than
Yes.
just be in the moment.
Yes, because trying to be something, it's not being you.
Exactly. Yeah. And we spend a lot of time doing that.
Yeah, we spend a
We're,
lot.
we're taught to do that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in schools and education. There's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of cultivating what being is correct,
Mm-hmm.
of actually being with what is
Yes,
actually present.
yes. And it's so liberating, no, to be able to just be present, and that's it.
Mm.
And for me now to be with you, um, I feel your connection. I feel you there with me, here with me. You
Yeah.
know, there I mean because you're on the other side of the internet, but you are here with me,
Mm. Mm.
and you feel close. And I'm just the first time in my life talking to you, but you feel very close to me.
Yeah. No, and I would say the same because it's funny. Like it's making me think about coaching because that's my background. But one of the things that my supervisor does a lot is he says whatever we open the conversation with, informally open it with, is usually relevant to where we go. And we might not even intentionally do it. And I work with people and I kind of, for people who are comfortable with that process, I'm like, let's see. And usually it's quite powerful and profound, but it doesn't start with setting the direction. It actually starts with just sharing what came to mind. And I was just thinking as you were talking, that's what we're doing. We literally just started with what came to mind, and I would say I would feel far more connected than I have, you know, in a lot of conversations where I haven't met someone for the first time. Because usually there's some kind of expectation, whether it's like prove something, sell something, explain something. Whereas in this moment, I'm like, oh, this could go anywhere, and therefore I yeah, it changes something actually being open to it and that someone else is open to it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. It gives us I don't know, confidence. It gives us well, the freedom. It gives us so many options. It
Mm.
opens up to so many possibilities.
Mm.
And the beauty is we don't care where it's going because we are here.
But I think that's the piece. It's not being shoehorned. I don't know if you're familiar with that saying,
No.
shoehorned in a direction, like shoehorn helps you put force your
Mm,
foot into a shoe. It's not being moved somewhere. It is just moving.
yes,
You know, yeah, I really, really love that. It's really interesting to start a conversation in this way. I really like it.
yes, yes. And it's beautiful. And plus, because we just started and we said, okay, let's hit record because if not, we're going to lose everything. And we said that in the first minute. We didn't
Mm.
we didn't even we weren't even talking and me asking you more about you or nothing because nothing. We just went in straight.
Yeah. And I kind of love that because I do think sometimes the pre-talk, I like
Mm.
it can be the richest, and then you're having a conversation then that is almost now performing, even if that's not what you're doing, because you've actually, that person already knows because you just
Yeah.
told them.
Yeah.
So like we know nothing. So I'm sitting here going, oh, this is really interesting now because I have I'm curious about what's important to you, what motivates you, what you care about. Whereas we would have informally got that out we might have got that out informally with like very direct questions. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
now I'm more curious about it rather than
Mm-hmm.
need the detail, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. And there is talking about we have something in common, very much in common, which is leadership.
Mm.
And so I want to ask you how you see leadership, and then
Yeah.
what do you see in leadership? No, there's so many connotations of leadership now in the world, and many that are misleading.
Mm. Mm. I like that. It's interesting because the more that I've worked in leadership, the more it's changed, and as in the way I see it changes. So the yeah, I would say the first thing is that most people, when I talk about leadership, and I do work with formal senior leaders, that's what they think of. They think of someone with the title.
Mhm.
But in my work, in change, in people moving, like genuinely moving and having an impact, I've started to see that I call them social leaders and thought leaders. So there's the people who move people because we trust them, we relate to them. There's something about them that feels, you know, that feels like they get it, and therefore we follow. They may not have a formal leadership position. They might not even want to be followed, right? They're just doing them, and we trust that. And then there's the thought leaders, and I think that's becoming more important actually, over the last kind of number of years, where there are people who are thinking more deeply about certain areas, and we can't all think deeply about everything. So,
Mhm.
and when we have to make a decision in that direction, we have a trust in them because of our previous experience or relationship with them, where we will trust the thinking that they've done around it.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes people try to suggest that the thought leaders and the social leaders are the titled leaders, like the people with official positions.
Yeah.
In my experience, they can be, like, sometimes that can occur, but I think the kind of leadership that we're thinking about more, that I think we need, is actually around thought and social. And I'd go a step further. We keep talking about leadership as if an individual. We keep unconsciously leaning on this hero leader idea, even when we talk about leadership. When I talk about leadership, it is a role I can fulfill in this moment. But I believe really good leaders can then also fulfill the followership role when that moment someone else can lead. So to me, it is a role that we fulfill in service to usually the group. But the issue is that we talk about leadership so much, we're not talking about followership,
Mhm.
how we're making those agreements about who we listen to and who we trust and who we give power or empower in that moment to influence us. I think we're seeing it as a person too
Yeah.
much, which is leaning on hero leadership. And I think, to me, leadership is actually a role we fulfill for the group, that we've agreed to, and that we have the authority and competence to, but that in the next moment, if somebody else has the authority or competence, they hold that. And I think we see it happening, but a lot of leadership development and conversations still aren't acknowledging that. They're still unconsciously leaning on a hero. So I see leadership as a role within a group, and it's a service to the group, but good leaders can pick up the role and put it down when they're not the right person. And we don't do a lot of teaching about that, I don't think, and a lot of the material doesn't talk about that.
Mhm.
But
No.
that would be how I see it. So I see it much more as a service, a holistic role, rather than a set of behaviors, which people talk about a lot.
Yeah.
Title.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the dog title that doesn't give you anything. No, I always say you get out and you have another title. No, in a company, for instance, you have a title. You go to the street and I'm this. Yeah, I don't have the title anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then for me, leadership has a lot to do also with self-leadership, but it's related to what you were saying, that when in a certain point in time, also me being a self-leader, and at that moment being a leader for others, and someone else comes and I am now not more the leader because the situation has changed, but I'm still myself leader. It's because I know that everyone is the same and everyone is their self leader, and at a certain point in time, we are leaders for others through our own leadership. No, so and it's not a title, and it's not a post, and then it's not above and below. No, it's just because in a certain situation there's a need of other skills, of other skills, and another role that someone else has and I don't have.
I think your piece about self-leadership is really important, because I'm sure you've seen it as well, where leaders don't self-lead, but they continue to like mismanage power with others, and they dominate, or they just can't, or they become invisible, but yet they're actually responsible for leading. And I think that's probably maybe a nicer way even to talk about followership, in the sense that followership is not about submission. It's actually about leading yourself, and being able to make the decision about what direction you're going, but from behind, and knowing that you're with someone in these decisions, but you might not be the decision maker. And do you know what, I think we don't do a lot of self-leadership discussions because it's often talked about from a power position, and there's nothing wrong with that. We have leaders in organizations that have power positions, but leaders who don't self-lead when they hold that power position tend to really struggle or tend to do harm. So they either internally struggle or they externally do harm. Like that's at least that's the kind of two outcomes I've seen, unless they seek support, to develop their own capacity to self-lead and to balance and to regulate themselves a bit. But I think that self-leadership is probably the most overlooked element of leadership that I think is essential for everyone, not just like for anyone with a title, but actually
everyone.
We're not leading ourselves. What are we doing? You know what I mean?
Yes, it's self-leadership is everywhere, in yourself, everyone to be their own leader. Now, for me, is this being the example of what I want to see. So if I am what I want to see, I'm leading for myself, and I might be a leader for other ones. But I'm doing it for myself and it's not in the ego self. That's what you were saying, no, hinting, not the self-leadership is not much talked about because it's been moved into the ego leadership, and it's not the ego leadership. It's really the heart leadership. It's the one that comes from the heart. You want the best for yourself, so you want it for everyone else. And then we go back in what you were saying. It's the service to the others, and the service comes through your service, through your own service. No.
And
the heart, yes.
And I think it's interesting because I even think that some of the leadership styles, like if anyone's like into servant leadership, don't come for me, but one of my challenges with the likes of servant leadership is it's meant to be in service, but what it still does is it still centers a leader being in service rather than, and that doesn't mean it's bad that everything has a place, but I do think that we keep unconsciously centering this idea of the individual leader and that kind of hero position, rather than actually if I'm self-leading outside of the ego, I will sense when I can add value by leading, and I will sense when I can add value by following, and the leader isn't inherently somehow the savior or the solution or the hero. And I'm finding that a lot of conversations, even when they're talking about participatory management or leadership or servant leadership, while they are talking about those things, there is an undertone of you being that leader, which for me is actually part of an issue, because it's actually not about you being that leader. And even group dynamics, it's not about an individual being the leader. It's about the group and the organization or the society being able to move, and that people serve that, as opposed to there is a person who is in service. Because even in that, there's a misalignment of equality, isn't there? There's this idea that I am somehow more capable than others, which I think fosters people being like incompetent, like weaponized incompetence at its best. I think occurs.
It's beautiful. Yes, it's because I have certain qualities in a certain moment in time I can lead. In other moments someone else leads, because it's the dynamic, and it's the heart leadership comes from the inside, so everyone is the same. It's just moving. It's like for me, for instance, co-creation has to do with leadership. I'm co-creating with you. I'm being who I am. I'm the example of what I want to see. You are the same, and we are here in a conversation, but I'm co-creating outside also, also in leadership, because I'm now the leader, but someone else is the leader in another situation or in another moment in time in the same situation, but because there's another skill that is required, but but it's this it's a dancing,
Mm,
it's a co-creation in everything, because everything comes from the inside out,
mm.
and everywhere we can do that everywhere.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that sometimes I'm thinking of something someone said in one of my classes, um, because I talk about this idea of exchanging and co-creation, and you're not responsible for everything, but you do have a role in helping everything, and they said, well, I don't want to be the expert, and by being the expert on the topic, they would end up being the leader. And I was like, well, are you the best positioned person to be the expert? And they're like, yes. Then why wouldn't you? And what it was that sometimes when we talk about, I think when we talk about leadership and we stop centering it as like an ego-based, power-driven piece, what ends up happening is then people reject leadership. But actually, it's both. We need you to be able to lead, and we need you to be able to leave room for others to lead appropriately. It's not a quality as a person, or it's not a thing. It's actually based on the context and the needs and the relationships and what's happening. And so I think there can be this a little bit of it's a bit like the polarization, this idea that either the leader is the solution to everything, or being a leader, you can never be a leader, it's a bad thing. And actually the question is, how does it help? Like in this moment, does it help if I lead? If it, does it, in this co-creation, am I holding something back and therefore not co-creating, even though I'm leaving room for other people to talk? That might not be co-creation because you're actually withholding something valuable. And I don't think we spend a lot of time on that context piece. Or even in growing up, like we tend to not give rewards for people being the support person. You know what I mean? And yet that's a fundamental role in lots of settings. So there's a piece for me about kind of not making anything good or bad, but actually thinking about when it's useful or helpful, and then when it's not useful or it's hindering. But in my experience, we don't talk about leadership from that way a lot. We talk about it as something that's good or bad, right or wrong. But actually it's a really nuanced piece, and co-creation is nuanced. Sometimes we have to just listen, but sometimes we have to actually offer a lot. And how do we know when to do that? That's kind of a critical thinking skill, isn't it, really, and a relational noticing.
Yes, mostly I think it's not so much the thinking, it's more the observing, the feeling, the respect, this knowing when to jump in, because you feel and you see that it's needed, and it's again, it's the same thing, moment by moment, not pre-thinking, moment by moment, really feeling and saying, okay, now I jump in because I can give, and now I go back because this person can give and I can receive. This observation, this seeing, this that's why I said it's co-creation, and it's this dance.
I like the dance,
because it's really, you're moving as things happen. So you are responding to the situations, and you are giving or receiving, and you will know when to give and receive based on what's required for everyone in that space.
I think it's interesting around that, because even the word co-creation to me feels really good. I use it a lot in my work around like inclusive leadership. You can't really do inclusive leadership to people. You have to be able to collaborate and co-create. Like you can't do it to people. You can do other types of leadership, but you can't do that one. And I think there's a piece about what happens when we can see what's missing, or we can see what's needed and we can offer it, but that something else is happening in the room too, like some other dynamics are there, and how do we move so that we can actually do the thing that needs to be done rather than get caught in the other thing. So sometimes the other thing is a power struggle, but sometimes the other thing is, people just stop doing something because it didn't get the outcome that they wanted. There's loads of reasons that we don't co-create even when we want to, and yet there is something enriching about that piece. Like, you can't, creating things with other people is never what I would have created on my own. It's not like we just added it together, as in like, sometimes people talk about collaboration, but what they're actually talking about is like 1 + 1 = 2. So you give me your idea, I'll give you my idea, and we'll squash them together, and we have like a better outcome. But in co-creation, it's like, I've got one, you've got one. Well, let me pull one apart a little bit. That might, oh wait, there's a two over there. You know, and then suddenly the outcome is not something I could have fathomed even on my
Yes,
own. We're not just adding something together, we're actually like creating it.
yes.
But I think that can be hard for people to swallow when they're used to like being the expert or having the answers or time constraint. Like there's all these things that happen in the day-to-day realities for people, that even when they have a good intention to co-create, it becomes difficult.
Collaboration.
Yeah.
It becomes collaboration.
Yeah.
It's because but we in education, and we were told to be in the mind and always think what's going to happen, what you're doing, and all those things. So for me, collaboration is like you said. For me, collaboration is comes from the doing. Okay, so and it's coming together because there's an outcome to create, but the outcome is there, no? So it's limiting. Co-creation comes from the being, from the present, and from the wholeness of everyone, and from the flowing, but not knowing where you're going. So we are not limiting. No, we are letting ourselves flow in co-creation, and we're creating something phenomenal that we couldn't even think about. No, and but that's very difficult for many people to accomplish or to go through, because they are afraid of the not knowing what's going to happen, what they are going to create. So they prefer to have an objective, a goal, and they together get there, no? By doing. Because also in collaboration, you sometimes have to give part of yourselves to make it happen. No? And in co-creation, you are you totally, and something bigger than ourselves is created. Because you flow and you don't know what it is, no? So people are not used to that, not knowing.
I find that interesting because I hadn't really thought about the goal piece, but it's funny because I came off a conversation where we were talking about the difference between goal motivation and like achieving an extrinsically given goal versus intrinsic motivations and you know, doing and talking about the things you want to talk about. So that goal thing is quite interesting. It's funny because my background is coaching psychology, but I probably annoy coaches quite a bit because goals I find really unhelpful, ironically, in the coaching, because like everyone comes with a goal because, you know, they need a focus to know that, you know, they kind of come with something anyway. But usually through the process of exploring the goal, we discover that they have other things that are important that haven't been nurtured, but they would never have come for the thing, you know.
Yes.
And that's that co-creation piece. And I was thinking, because I supervise coaches, sometimes when I start supervising a coach, that they'll be like trying to measure their success on the goal that their client originally brought, and not actually on the change that happened during just the conversation. Like, you know, or they might, I don't get it as much anymore, but they might want like a particular tool, and they're like, what tool will I use? And I'm like, well, I think you should talk to them and see how they are and where they are and what they want and what they need, and then what they want and need that they haven't even verbalized, but you can feel or sense, or, you know, that they're indicating in some way. But that actually can be really, really scary and actually it can be scary for clients too. Some of my leadership clients go, you know, like, where's the skeleton? Where's the topics we're going to cover? And I'm like, what do you want us to do? And it's not that I'm not applying a process to it, but it's that I'm not limiting it by their interpretation of what they need or my interpretation of what they need. I think I've become so comfortable with it now that it's different. But in the beginning, I remember, and I, you know, early coaches starting off, they would be like, will we cover communication today? I'm like, did they bring communication up? No, but they said it in their first meeting. I'm like, that was 4 sessions ago. Do you think maybe something has shifted for them, like in that time as well? You know, there's something about that, but I think clients can find it intimidating too, because especially if it's a corporate setting, like leadership is often in a corporate setting. community settings, it can be a bit different, but in corporate settings,
Yeah.
they're often, it's like, how can I trust that I'm bringing what I need to these sessions with you if we don't have a plan?
Mhm.
How can I trust that what emerges is what I need? And I'm like, well, you're bringing what's worrying you, right? Like, yeah, but that's probably what you need. Like, you know, but it's just interesting that, and then other clients get it straight away because they're like, oh, obviously this is what I need. But it is so different to, especially in corporate settings, it's so different to some of the rules or the you know, and I say best practice with bunny ears, like, because I don't know what it's best for a lot of the time, you know, and like, can we unpack what you mean by best practice? But there is something in not just in both people being comfortable, or more than both people. Like, I don't know if you've ever suggested to an organization that you do an emergent approach. Well, like 50% of the time when I do, they go, all right, if they've built a relationship with me, they go, okay, because they've seen that I used it, even though that isn't what we agreed first. I just used it as a part of the process. But if we haven't worked together, they're like, you just want to go into those rooms with a general idea of these unmet needs and see where that brings us. Now, there is some process to it, like I'm using like good processes, but ultimately I'm like, yeah, instead of me telling them they need to be better at something, why don't we go into the room and say, this is an opportunity to be better at something. What do you want to be better at? And then what do you think you need to be better at? And where does that bring us? And it often brings us away from being better at anything, you know, like they often go, actually, that's not actually what we need at all. You know, that's just what HR want, or, you know, OD want, or the L&D team. Yeah, so it's interesting, I think, to trust the co-creation.
Yes.
When everything around you is trying to have you fitting a different formula, I guess.
Yeah, boxing you in, no?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find that when you work with leaders and you work with organizations, that trying to support that emergent piece can require an awful lot of trust in you as a person before they're willing to even think about it?
Yes. And where I work, I'm leading a team, and I work in consultants in IT. And at the beginning, I'm there already 6 years and a half. And at the beginning, they didn't know how I was leading. No, for me, it's for everyone to be their leader, no, and then highlighting that, and for each of them having the possibility to be themselves and all this stuff. And at the beginning, they didn't understand me, and after 1 year, one of the persons told me, Jeanette, so good that you do that, because we didn't know what you were what you were doing, and we didn't know we needed that.
So that, I love that we didn't know we needed that.
Yes.
So that's actually, I was talking to someone about this today. Often when we choose to go for coaching, we identify what we perceive as the problem and what we perceive as the solution before we've ever been supported to explore it or feel it, or and often we enter into a process if there's some emergence allowed, and we get what we need, even if it wasn't a cognitive knowing. And I think that that's really powerful, but it can be really challenging for the structures that exist in, like, especially in IT, in organizations where it's like, you know, we want to do the PO, so what's the scope, what's the outcomes, what's it, you know, and you're like, we can do all that, but the minute you do that, you've just like, you may be reducing the value of what we can do.
You're boxing.
Yeah, you're boxing people in. I think that that's really interesting. And that piece about helping people to be themselves, you know, I don't think people know they're not being themselves often until they start.
Yeah. Many times. And myself, I didn't know I wasn't myself. Many years ago. Well, many years ago, no, a while ago. But until you see it, no, that you've been living based on what you have been told, what you have learned, and other things, but not really being yourself, and not really showing up as who you are because of scare. no, because you have the angst of showing up as who you are and or what you think you are, because at the beginning you even don't know what it is to really flow in freedom, no?
Yeah.
So you are scared. And
Mm.
I see it in the teams, no? They are scared to show themselves because they don't know if they will be accepted. They don't know if they will say something that it's not appropriate. They don't know if they are behaving as they should with with the company. So there are many thoughts and many limitations that don't allow them or us to be.
Mm. Mm. It's making me think about there's this pushback at the moment, and I'm kind of agreeing with it about, bring your whole self to work, be authentic. And there's this pushback, and I agree with the pushback, which is, well, bring what is required. You know what I mean? Like we're not the same person in every environment, even if we are at a core being ourselves, but the reason I'm thinking about that is I find that we spend a lot of time, or people spend a lot of time, thinking about what's appropriate for an environment. And actually, if we weren't thinking about it, our behavior probably wouldn't be inappropriate. But the people whose behavior is inappropriate rarely thinks about, is this appropriate? It's a bit like, when, I don't know if you've heard that kind of joke about narcissism, I think I'm a narcissist. Well, generally narcissists don't think they're narcissists, so you're on a good track. But there's something about that where I find that a lot of the ways we cultivate and manage ourselves in workplaces aren't actually a problem. But because of our experience or our history or our fears, like you said, we do it. But I also think there's a flip side, which is people who should be managing their behavior. I'm not saying not being themselves, but managing their behavior because it is inappropriate or it is harmful, very rarely consider that they are inappropriate or harmful. And I think that's kind of funny because a little bit like this idea of, the people who need leadership coaching or development tend not to come for leadership coaching and development, but the people who don't need it tend to be signing up first because there's something about, it's that self-awareness gap,
Yes.
And obviously that's not true for everyone, or not true factually. It's just an interesting thing around, a lot of people who worry about what they say and do at work, of which I had spent years. I've wasted years of thinking about what I said and did. And sometimes if I'm having a vulnerable time, I will replay a comment I made and I will think about the 100 different ways it could have been misunderstood, as opposed to that the comment itself was even not like, it would be that I can escalate how it was wrong, even when it in its own right isn't even, an issue. But I actually, ironically, I remind myself that the people who behave inappropriately very rarely ever even ask themselves if they're behaving inappropriately. And I think that can be a little bit relieving, because I think some people are kind of quite concerned with how they're perceived, but also concerned with how they impact others. And then other people are not worried about how they're perceived or how they impact others. And so I think it's kind of it's a bit of a funny thing, I think, in workplaces. I'm thinking of a couple of people who I've come across in the last 12 years, and I'm thinking they should have been thinking that's inappropriate, and not hiding themselves, but managing their behavior, because actually it was harmful and it wasn't. And it's interesting because it's not heart to heart. So when people say I'm just being myself, excusing something, it's not. It's usually a defense. So it's still in the ego usually.
Yes.
And actually when you work with that, those people often are like, oh, I don't have to be the loudest in the room to be safe, for instance. So then they don't have to start saying these things again, or but it can be expressed differently by different people. So some people's defenses has us managing ourselves and over managing, and then other people's defenses have them kind of over acting or misbehaving, and yet they're both kind of the same thing at play. Like ego is still the thing, it's just the behavior is slightly different. So yeah,
it's the ego, but it's the outside world, let's say. It's the projection, it's them projecting themselves into the outside world. Either I have to be more quiet because whatever they can think, or the other one is I'm going to be this because of what I see and the way they think, no? So
Yeah.
but when you go inside and you go into the heart, no? And you are in your heart and then what happens outside doesn't matter so much, because you know that whatever you say or do, it comes from the heart and it will be okay. So your perception from the outside world goes into the inside. Say, well, let's say you live from the inside out. It's easier than you live from the outside in.
There's this little story, do you mind me telling you? It's like a really but it's kind of an example of that. So I was at a conference, but it was a conference about, what was it, spirituality and something. I was doing a piece with a colleague. We co-created it live in the moment. I'd say the room didn't know what to do with us, because they were like, we weren't talking through a thing. We were explaining, we were having a conversation that we had prepared. We prepared the topic, but not the conversation. And in that one, I witnessed a guy stand up and say there was a conversation about spirituality and racism. Okay. And that was the presentation. And this participant, this listener stood up and kind of said, you know, I take issue with a bit of your perspective or whatever. And it was a reasonable position to actually take. And then he said, and he's a white man, and he said, you know, I've been talking about, we'll say, the layers of spirituality with some of my my friends who are of different races. And I find that when we meet at a certain place, race dissolves in the conversation. And it's something I've been talking to them about. And I understood that, because I understood what he was referencing as an experience. And I got his experience. So the person speaking kind of freaked out, because they were making the point, which is also very true in the world, that there's inequality based on race, and race doesn't disappear, you know, and society has differences. And that is also true. But what I thought was really interesting was this person was talking about a different experience to what this person was talking about. But the person presenting couldn't move past their point of view about race. And this person was a white man. So it's two white men having this conversation. And I say that because he then decided that this other man was engaging in white fragility. And he made all these assumptions, right? And that happens loads in conferences about race. There's loads of white fragility. So I have no issue with calling that out. But it wasn't what was happening. And what was interesting was that this person was so stuck on their position that they only saw this man's race and didn't see what he was saying, which actually wasn't about race. He was basically saying, underneath the ego, outside of the social structures, when I sit with a human being and they sit with me, and my friends with different racial experiences, I've asked them, is race in this moment? You know, not, is it in when we have coffee? Because, you know, it can be weaved into things, but is it in this moment? Because he was trying to understand from a different point of view. And his point was, they would say in those moments, not when we're having coffee, there isn't some white supremacy in there. They're saying in those moments of just heart-to-heart connection, they don't feel that race is in the room, like that race is relevant. But then in the same conversation with him in another moment, they could, because they're explaining that in that moment, they're somewhere else. They're not heart-to-heart. The presenter could not get to the point where the presenter actually othered the gentleman saying it and ignored that actually he had limited the conversation, because the gentleman wasn't saying that white fragility doesn't exist. He wasn't saying that in society it doesn't exist. He wasn't even saying that with his friends it didn't exist. But he said there are these moments where something feels different, and I've talked to my friends with different racial experiences to see how they feel in that moment alongside how I feel. And I've asked about race, and race was somewhere else, and you know, so it was this kind of and he was like, but that's not ignoring all of the other layers. But this gentleman couldn't accept that, because he was so focused on being right. And the irony is, from my work and stuff and my research, the gentleman presenting was accurate. What he's talking about and white fragility, he was spot on. However, that wasn't what this other gentleman was talking about. He was talking about something he's discovered in his relationships when he comes into contact in a particular way. And he was completely not seen. In fact, I would say it went further than not being seen. He was kind of then attacked, because obviously the speaker had overt power because they were given the position to speak. And so it looked like that he was just boxed into the white fragility box. And I spoke to him afterwards because I was just fascinated. And he was like, the thing is, I agree with everything. They're spot on about what he goes, I wasn't talking about that though. I was trying to say that something else happens when I have these conversations in this way. And I was like, and he's like, they completely not only misinterpreted it, misused the position, you know. But I think that can happen quite a bit where we think we're in contact with someone and we're not. I suppose that was the point, that he thought, the gentleman presenting thought he was in contact with the person who said it, and therefore was teaching him about white fragility. But actually it had nothing to do with white fragility in that moment. It had to do with him talking to people with different racial experiences about a particular moment of connection, and asking, is their experience in that moment, you know, relevant to race, because he wasn't experiencing that, and was that because he was a white man? You know, totally missed him.
Yeah, because he was in his head.
Yeah.
And not in the heart, in the listening, the presence of the other one sharing. So he was in his head already thinking what the other one was talking, so he got triggered. But because in his head he had this thought of that. It happens a lot now when you talk to someone that is not present, and you talk about something and they just respond to you something else because they just heard your first word and they did the relationship in their head of the word, and they thought that you whatever you continued talking, they didn't listen, they just took the first word, you know. And then they and you're like, yes, you know. So it's because they are in their mind.
That's I think that's really well explained. And I think that piece about, you know, being in your head versus kind of being present or being in your heart, I'm thinking about all of the situations that occur. There's one in my mind in particular, but situations that occur where it looks like conflict. So like I'm in rooms and people have a lot of power, and they could take offense, or not even take offense, but they could decide that they want us to talk about something else, and we're talking about what's been agreed. And what can often happen in those situations is you get standoffs, you know, in those situations. But one of the things that I found helpful is actually, instead of me holding my position or even falling into theirs, because I could do either before I had the connection with what was happening, was actually understanding why. So understanding what they were trying to communicate, not getting confused by how they were communicating. You know, like someone says, Jeanette, you're awful. Now you can get confused by that and be like, oh, or I can be like, why is that really important to you in this moment? And in that moment, even if I don't agree with the content of your conversation, we might be able to get back into connection, and therefore we might be able to together to actually move forward. Because if I'm missing what you're saying, it means you're missing me in some way too. You know, it's a mutual missing of each other. And I have found that to be kind of reassuring as a person. You know, like if I'm angry at someone, which happens lots, because I don't want to say I love all my emotions. I have all of my emotions quite strongly. But if I have you know, if I'm, I don't know, angry, or I'm giving out, or I'm blaming, which happens, I also have this piece in my head going, I have an unmet need that I don't know how to access in a different way. So that's why I'm using an approach that I probably wouldn't choose consciously. And that kind of grace towards myself has helped me start to have that grace towards others. So I don't need to cut them off when they're angry at me. Now I might still do it because I'm a person who gets triggered like everyone, but I have another choice, which then means I can actually be easier with others. And I think that comes back to your self-leadership piece, which is, if I can't be with my own stuff, I can't be with your stuff, whatever that is. And if I have rules on myself, whether I mean to or not, I'm going to put those rules onto you. And I think that's where this presence thing is more than just being present. It's in that moment, co-creation can occur, because actually we don't have rules to work within. In a way, you know, we've got to agree them between us. You know, like if you take this conversation in a slightly different direction, I get to choose whether I go with you or not. Whereas if you said, we're going to talk about A, B, and C, I would then have to interpret what A, B, and C means, and would probably restrict myself even further than what you meant. You know, But I do think you're right that difference between being so preoccupied with our own thinking that we miss what the actual person was, not what they were saying, but what they were trying to say.
Yeah, because we're not listening.
Yeah,
We're listening to ourselves and not listening. Yeah.
I really like how you phrase that, because I've thought about this a lot, but when you phrased that a moment ago, I find that really helpful, because it was succinct but not oversimplified. So when you explain that, I did like that explanation.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks so much. I just want for the listeners in this case really to explain a little bit about your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I would love that.
Okay, I really appreciate that. So my book is called Inclusive Leadership: Navigating Organizational Complexity. And I wrote it, there's lots of motivations, but I'm doing a PhD in inclusive leadership. But I've been working with leaders for over 12 years. And before I even started using the word inclusive, I've always used that as a baseline, because it's a particular approach that I think works really well. The book has come out of about 3 years of very specific data gathering and conversations and pattern recognition. And people are being asked to be more inclusive, but then they're not being supported with, it's really interesting, the being part. So that there's 3 parts to leadership in my mind. There's the knowing, doing, and being. And knowing and doing, I think, gets a lot of attention and practice. But being is a bit more complex. So we don't always have an easy way to guide leaders through the being part. And so the book has some practical skills, it has some knowledge, because we need those things, but there's a piece about understanding how you're being. And it's done in kind of some stories, some examples, some concepts, but it helps people to acknowledge how they're being. So for instance, the very first chapter is called Curiosity Killed the Cat. And I don't want to spoil it for readers, but it's a story about me getting in trouble for being curious, and then a little explanation about how that being, and that part of me is constantly there, right? How that being gets me into trouble all the time, but also how it is the foundation to my success. And I, like, as in anything that I've achieved that I'm proud of, and not even professionally, just that I'm genuinely proud of, came from me being genuinely a curious person, even when there's a cost to pay. You know, sometimes it's easier not to ask some questions, but I ask because I'm curious. And so there's some examples of what I mean by being, but then there's also some activities, like, you know, where people can actually do, assessment is a strong word, but can use some reflective questions to get a sense of what's influencing their way of being, what they might have put on as a coat that isn't authentic, but is kind of how they move through things. But the way I've kind of defined it is, it's to stop people working so hard at being inclusive, but I would say doing inclusion, that actually they can start being it, right? So you know, work smarter, not harder type of thing. But the other thing is, how do we use inclusive leadership in the reality that our organizations are complex, rather than there's some simplified discussions about it in the world, as if like, do this and you're inclusive, or do that. But actually, inclusive leadership is about navigating the ongoing complexity in your organization. And that if you're doing it or being it, it's not that things become simplified, it's just you can navigate with more ease, and usually with others. So my big thing is that collective approach, that we together are moving through this, rather than losing people on the way or pushing people in different directions. So it goes live on the 13th of May. And anyone who pre-orders will get it on that day, and then I launch it officially on the 18th of May. And there's some really lovely stories in it, like not just my own, because there's even a piece at the back which is it takes a village, because I think I have 2 pages of thank yous, because even in designing this book, I use an inclusive approach, where people were like, did you think of this? And I'm like, oh no, that's brilliant. I didn't need, and it was because we've worked together. I've got people I've worked with to read it and to say, Sheila, this is the, you know, this is this piece, or, oh my God, you didn't talk about it in the book, but you talk about it in our work, and it moved me, I think, you know. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that moved you. So even in writing it, even though I've written it and it does have research in it, it is actually quite a collaborative piece, and I'll say collaborative because there was a goal, which was to put it into a book, based on the definition you've given me. And then the other thing is I have two other people who've contributed because I use their work all the time, and I didn't want to rephrase their work. I felt it was really important to give them a chapter to frame their own work.
Nice.
So yeah, and I would say it has like an Irish, UK, European lens, whereas a lot of the books around this come from an American lens. And I think that matters. This context changes our relationship with it a little bit. Yeah, so I think there's some kind of nuances. Yeah, and I'll share one other thing. So have you heard of Elizabeth Gilbert? She wrote Eat, Pray, Love. Yeah, so I'm mad about Elizabeth Gilbert. But in her book, Big Magic, which I read, I think within a week of it coming out, she talks about how ideas come to you, and if you don't bring them to life, they'll find someone else.
Yeah.
Well, I was sitting with this idea for about 3 years, and I'd done all my reflective worksheets because I had been capturing patterns and thoughts and feelings about it for a long time. And then I sat down one day and I listened to a podcast with somebody that I have a deep respect for being interviewed on this podcast. And he talked about how he was moved to write his books. He's a psychologist that I'm mad about, Dr. Tony Humphreys. He's a relational expert, amazing man, and very interesting. But when he was saying it, I got this instant feeling, which was now or somebody else will write it. And I'm like, well, you've done 3 years of recording, reflections, reflective practice. Like I had been gathering live experiences and insights for 3 years. And I just got this feeling as I listened to it. And I said, right, well, we're going to write that. So if I'm honest, somebody else probably could have written it. If I gave it 3 months, somebody else would have written it, I think, because it feels like it's been missing in the literature, but yet we've been living a lot of this, and a lot of people will go, oh, I do that already. And they just didn't know it was an inclusive practice. A bit like your co-creation, like the ultimate inclusive practice is co-creation and collaboration. Those two things are required. You cannot be inclusive without them. So a lot of people are doing a lot right. And I wanted to focus on that as well, not just on this is wrong or this is right, but actually, yeah. So hopefully there's some things in there that people can take and can use and can then even maybe reshape, because in your context, you might say, actually, I like this and this, but I'd add this to it. And that's what I'm hoping readers do, is that they take it as almost an invitation of consideration, but they do something with it that they own in some way, that they create.
Beautiful. Yes. Here you're giving the example with your book. You're giving the example of things that can be done, and everyone in their own authentic way.
Yeah.
So you're being a leader, really a self-leader, sharing so that others can do it for themselves too.
I appreciate that.
I appreciate you, and thank you so much for being here and co-creating with me today.
Thank
really
you.
Nice. And we for sure we'll have other conversations. I would love that.
I think there might be other co-creation occurring.